Hi, everyone. This is America Adapts, the climate change podcast. Hey adapters, welcome back to another exciting episode. I'm partnering with World Wildlife Fund, and we're going to talk about disaster risk and the workforce of the future. Yes, creating that next generation of adaptation professionals is near and dear to me. Anita Van Breda of WWF's Environment and Disaster Management Program kicks things off by sharing the program's 20-year journey integrating nature into disaster risk management. Then, Dr. Ken Conca joins to discuss large-scale flood control in Ellicott City, Maryland, advocating for community-driven solutions. Next, Irantzu Serra Lasa, founder of Resilure, shares insights on post-disaster housing recovery and the need for professionalized shelter reconstruction. And finally, Achala Navaratni from the American Red Cross highlights the role of sustainability, adaptation, and interdisciplinary expertise in humanitarian work. Each also discusses what skills and education will be useful to become a professional in disaster risk management and adaptation. This is a great learning episode if you're thinking about joining the adaptation universe. Okay, let's join Anita Van Breda of World Wildlife Fund to kick off this episode. Hey adapters, joining me is Anita Van Breda. Anita is the Senior Director for Environment and Disaster Management at World Wildlife Fund and my co-host for this episode. Welcome back to the podcast, Anita.
Thanks, Doug. Always good to talk with you.
Great to have you back on. And so you've been on quite a bit, but we're going to do this anyway. Give us a bit more about what you do there.
I'm the Senior Director for Environment and Disaster Management at World Wildlife Fund, and my program works to integrate nature into disaster risk management. We work on recovery, reconstruction, but increasingly using nature to reduce disaster risk.
We're going to do a bit of a reflection on the EDM program here, and it's celebrating its 20-year anniversary. Can you share a bit about how the program started and what its core mission has been over the years?
The program started in 2005, and we actually started in response to the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004. And the idea was to integrate nature into rebuilding from that event, which, as you might remember, some of your listeners might remember, that was both an earthquake and a tsunami that devastated the coastline of Indonesia, as well as many other countries. We worked for 5 years in 4 different countries, partnering with the American Red Cross to ensure that shelter programs, water and sanitation programs, livelihood programs included nature in order to reduce risk for people going forward. And that was the first time for WWF to really jump into the issues of disasters and responding to disasters, and to better understand how we could modify and adapt how we do conservation, how we do natural resource management, and apply it to an extreme event context. And what we've learned through that process, and this won't be surprising, Doug, to you and probably your listeners, is it's really hard to find a safe, healthy, prospering human community without a safe and healthy, prospering natural system. Helping people respond to disasters, rebuilding lives and livelihoods very much includes issues around environment and natural resource management. And over the years, we've been asked to work with local governments and community partners all around the world in response to extreme events, most of which are related to our changing climate, but not all. We also work on other hazards such as earthquakes and even sometimes around issues dealing with conflict.
2 decades, that's a long time. What do you consider, and I guess maybe everyone would consider, the most significant achievements of the EDM program, but I also want you to think specifically, maybe you have a favorite moment, because I want you to think about those 2 things.
I think for the program, one of the most significant thing that sticks out to me is we're really dedicated to training and capacity building. And the reason why is every disaster is different. Every disaster context is different. So there's not just a blueprint you can take off the shelf and apply it the same way. So we really invested over the years in working with people to support them to use our tools and technique and modify and adapt them to their local culture, to their local language, to the local challenges that they face. And that has been very rewarding work, but it's also what inspired me to want to talk to you today about in terms of training the next generation of practitioners, training the next generation of the workforce in issues that deal with disaster management. So I think that's been, from a programmatic perspective, one of our focus areas over the years, and one of the areas I'm most proud of. I'm often asked, is this not really challenging work? Is this not really depressing work, working around disasters? And yes, it is very challenging at times, but I always leave these struggling places that have been hit by an extreme event more inspired than anything else, because I always see people coming together and people focusing on how do we turn this disaster into something positive going forward, and how do we do things differently so that we don't face the same kind of risk again. And that gives me great inspiration and also a fair amount of hope that we can adapt and modify and address some of the challenges that we're going to be facing in all our societies going forward.
I'm going to do a bit of a pivot here, and we're going to talk about nature-based solutions and workforce development, which you just alluded to there. And I'm going to refer to as the nature-based solutions as NBS going forward. How does NBS fit into the broader goals of disaster risk reduction and recovery?
Yeah, NBS, it's a good shorthand for nature-based solutions. We often talk about natural or nature-based approaches to disaster risk reduction, and it fits in many different ways. For example, if we're rebuilding roads or hospitals or community centers, physical infrastructure in a post-disaster context, there's a role also for natural infrastructure as part of that process. We want our hospitals and our roads and our physical communities to be able to last for the long term, to not get washed away in the next flood or fall down in the next earthquake. So we can weave nature into that planning and into the design of that infrastructure to help ensure the longevity over time. And that's why we encourage and facilitate environmental expertise, working with humanitarian expertise, engineering expertise, to look at a place and think of it like a system, and what are the different systems that need to come together in order to secure people's future going forward.
There's this misconception that NBS jobs are limited to rural areas, or it's just people planting trees. Can you elaborate on the diversity of positions and skills needed to do NBS?
Yeah, and again, that's something that inspires me on a day-to-day basis doing my work, because it is so diverse. It calls on so many different disciplines. It can be engineers, it can be hydrologists, it could be lawyers, it could be journalists, it could be artists, it could be financial management people. All kinds of different disciplines have to come together in order to make these systems as resilient as possible going forward. It's not enough to just train a single discipline. It helps to really raise awareness, raise the comfort level of lots of different disciplines, to understand how their work, their expertise, their skills could be applied in a disaster recovery situation, and who else they might find in that space, and how do you work together successfully with them. We talk about community organizers or community engagement and outreach. We talk about the technical skills and the soft skills, and combining them in order to meet the challenge of the current situation, and again, to reduce risk for the future.
What are some of the key barriers to creating this robust workforce in this type of space?
There are some barriers around the way we used to do things, the way we've done things historically, and wanting to resist change. And there are some barriers with reward systems, with recruitment systems for these different sectors. There's some barriers in the educational system, the way we segregate ourselves into different subject matters. All of those, I think, are manageable with enough creativity and willingness to think and act differently.
We're going to talk about the workforce recruitment and climate adaptation, two very important issues to me, and we're going to be talking a lot about that through this MBS. So for my listeners, can you give them a sneak preview? We recruited these particular speakers, or you recruited them, but what were you hoping to accomplish with recruiting these specific ones?
I think what your listeners will hear is just the scale and scope of different issues that are involved with managing disaster and disaster risk and the implications, therefore, for the future workforce. So Dr. Ken Conca tells a really interesting story of experiences that he went through really in his own backyard with a flood and what he observed with the response from the local community, ranging from government officials to individual shopkeepers, and the implications of the historical aspect of that area, of the geological aspect, of the hydrological regime of that aspect, the legal mechanisms involved with responding to and preparing for floods. And it's just a fascinating story of a local place and his observations of what that means for all of us going forward. Iru has a different perspective from her experience, both as a practitioner on the ground all around the world in different challenging locations, and her transition now to working more closely with the academic community and training young people on the front end of their careers in both architecture and landscape architecture and law. And then we'll hear from Achala Navaratni, who is a practitioner today, but comes from both an engineering and an environmental background and now works in the humanitarian sector. Again, just a range of different academic and practical experiences and stories that have implications for the workforce of the future.
I'm looking forward to this. And the flooding event that Ken's going to talk about, just a little preview. I'm not going to steal his thunder, but I lived in the region when that happened, and it was just so shocking, the scale of that. And so he's going to dig into that response. It's really interesting. Anita, you're going to come back on at the end of this episode. We're going to do this wrap up and get a few more thoughts, but I'll see you at the end.
Okay. Thanks, Doug.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Dr. Ken Conca. Ken is a professor in the Department of Environment, Development, and Health at American University. Hi, Ken. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Doug. Great to be with you.
Before we get into the content here, can you tell us a bit about what you do there at American University?
Sure. I teach in a graduate program in global environmental policy, and basically we're trying to train the next generation of leaders on the issues of the sort that this podcast is concerned with. Most of my research as a professor centers on a couple of themes. I do a lot of work on conflict resolution and peace building around environmental issues and natural resource use. We know that these things can be triggers for tension and conflict, but we also need to pay more attention to the ways that they can be triggers for peaceful cooperation. I do a lot of work on that. Substantively, most of my work focuses on water, and I'm particularly interested in the way that water adaptations that climate change is leading us toward or forcing upon us can create conflict risks and social tensions, and how do we manage those tensions and turn them in a cooperative direction.
And again, Anita's here co-hosting this episode with me, but I'm going to start off first. You wrote a book on floods in Ellicott City, Maryland. That was the focus there. And so what did you learn about the state of flood risk management?
The main thing I learned is that it's a really hard conversation. Ellicott City is a 250-year-old mill town, and it was hit twice in the space of 22 months with 1 in 1,000-year rainfall events, each time triggering a devastating flash flood that produced widespread damage and fatalities. After the first storm and flood, the county launched a very ambitious watershed master plan to promote watershed-wide flood resilience. After the second storm, things became much more contentious, and really extreme solutions started to come out of the woodwork. Tear down the historic district at the heart of the town, drill a $100 million megatunnel through the granite bedrock and underneath the town to bypass it entirely with stormwater, crack down on development in the watershed. And what I realized as I watched this drama unfold over about a 6-year period was that the issue on the table might be, how do we manage stormwater runoff? But it's really about some much tougher questions. How do we decide what we know to be true? How do we deal with the uncertainty around these problems? Who gets to speak for the watershed? And above all, what are we willing to change or sacrifice about the places that we love? Those were really the challenges as the county and the town and the watershed have tried to find their way on a path toward resilience. And Ellicott City is a town that seems to have every advantage in this effort. It's an affluent community. There's a lot of expertise. tradition of open government, mobilized civil society, and it's a small town with the sort of fierce identity that historic places often achieve. And yet, despite all those advantages, they really struggled with some of these deeper questions. And so I've been trying to pull the lessons out of that struggle.
First of all, I really love that you wrote this book, and I know it's going to make such a contribution to flood risk management. You and I have been colleagues for some time, and I have this program on flood risk management, and all the things that you are pointing out here are true that we have found and challenging all around the world. And as difficult as it is in a place like Ellicott City, you can imagine how much more difficult all these things are in many other places. And so I wanted to ask you about, based on your experience with the floods and the book that you wrote, your observations in particular about nature-based solutions and natural approaches to flood management.
Unfortunately, they were marginal to the response that the county crafted. And I think this happened for a couple of reasons. At first glance, it's a tough watershed in which to pursue nature-based solutions. It's hilly, granite, bedrock, clay soils, overdeveloped, highly urbanized. And so it's not a place where you'd simply say, protect this stand of trees, protect these naturally occurring stream beds and so on. The streams are already very highly channelized and modified. Much of the forest has been cleared and so on. But as we know, that doesn't mean that there isn't a place for nature-based solutions, and nature-based solutions in urban areas is a really important trend. In this case, I think they were marginal for a couple of reasons. First, from the start, the county defined the problem as building infrastructure, retention of stormwater, conveyance of stormwater, in a way that would manage a very large storm. So the FEMA's baseline 100-year storm, the storm that's used as the baseline for the National Flood Insurance Program, that was about the smallest episode that they looked at in the modeling and the planning. And they fairly quickly, without modeling it, came to the conclusion that nature-based solutions couldn't contribute much in this 4 square mile watershed. So it was never really considered. And that was unfortunate because many people in the watershed were concerned about the more frequent and smaller storm episodes that caused a lot of havoc and did a lot of damage. And there's a much stronger possibility for nature-based solutions there. And also, as we know, Ellicott City was not going to solve this problem with rain gardens and rain barrels. But taking those sort of household and neighborhood and block by block community-based approaches, it does a lot to mobilize people. It does a lot to educate them about their watershed, about the history, about the role of land use, and all these other important factors. And in this case, I think it was really a missed opportunity. The other reason I'd say that it got marginalized was that there was a basic lack of familiarity. Like many jurisdictions, this is a county that has a Department of Public Works that's full of engineers doing good work, and a Department of Planning and Zoning that's full of city planners, and of course, some lawyers. And neither of those bodies really had the expertise on board to work with nature-based solutions. And so there's some things done on the margins, but not nearly as much as I think might have been possible.
That leads me to a follow-up question then. And really the heart of the matter for me is I spend nights awake thinking about the next generation of practitioners and how do we train them for addressing this very issue, because I don't think we're doing enough in the US or internationally to prepare people for the future and to prepare them to use nature-based approaches for flood risk management and disaster risk management, broadly speaking. And you just confirmed that for me, that these sectors and these county offices have good people working, doing good work. But in your view, and with your experience now with writing the book, do you think that the academic community is teaching and building capacity for the next generation of individuals and agencies that are going to find themselves on the front lines of managing floods or other disasters and be able to put more thought and planning into the role that nature can play as part of risk reduction? And if the academic and vocational training institutes are not doing that, what do you think they might be doing different to support a different future?
We're trying, I would say, is the quick answer. I think the key to this is to train the next generation in ways that helps them to see the whole watershed, the whole landscape, right? The social as well as the ecological, the green as well as the gray. we often get into these sort of false dichotomies and false distinctions, and the idea is that engineers are going to favor gray infrastructure and ecologists are going to favor nature-based or green infrastructure and so on. And that's a sort of intractable divide. When you look at a watershed like the Tiber Hudson in Ellicott City, 4 square miles, 250 years, beginning with the development of the mills down by the river, one of the real seats of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. There's a really complicated socio-ecological history in this watershed. And we need to be better stewards in a place like that of both the green and the gray. I think the key is to design programs or curricula that let students see the whole watershed. And of course, that means getting them out into the watershed as well. And so a lot more hands-on and participatory forms of learning. A second thing that we need to do is, and I believe this very strongly, we need to strengthen our delivery of lifelong learning programs so that those engineers I was talking about earlier, or those planners, or the lawyers, or whomever, the ecologists, traditionally trained professionals, which we still need, they've got to be able to acquire new skill sets. For example, a certain form of science literacy, if they're an economist, or a certain degree of literacy in conflict resolution, if they're an engineer. Some of those folks are going to come back to school and they're going to get entirely new degrees, such as the master's program that I teach in here in DC. But most of them are not going to do that. They're going to supplement their training. And so we need to do a much better job with what's called education by the slice, short courses, intensive workshops, boot camp type trainings, or concentration areas. Let somebody come back and take 3 courses over the course of the year so that they can develop new competencies without having to invest in the time and the expense and the life uprooting of seeking an entirely new graduate degree, because that's not realistic for most people.
Related to that, Ken, a lot of your academic work focuses on conflict and conflict resolution. What does the Ellicott City story teach us about the role of conflict management in dealing with risk?
This is actually, I think, a big piece of the story. The county was not prepared for the level of contentiousness that was going to occur around this space. They launched a very participatory, in some ways, watershed master planning process. And the 80 to 100 people who lived in the heart of town or owned property there or were historic preservation activists and so on, they came together in a series of workshops and they had a lot of dialogue, did a lot of planning. And that was good as far as it went, but that was never going to give legitimacy to the responses in a county with almost 350,000 people. And I think the county struggled with some of the participatory aspects of this, making sure that all stakeholders were at the table. I don't mean to suggest that this has been a failure. The county has done a lot of things. They've implemented some warning systems. They've implemented a very smart debris cleaning program after smaller storms so that the debris doesn't pile up and make the big storms even worse and so on. So there have been some achievements here, but the county wasn't prepared for the contentiousness. And in some ways, the approach that the county took arguably made the contentiousness worse than it had to be. There's a lot of uncertainty around this. There's a lot of different ways of knowing about the problem. And the county brought in a lot of experts who did flood modeling and in some ways tried to impose an official story on this is the truth of flood risk in this watershed. And rather than allow for some of the knowledge controversies, some of the uncertainties, what can we say about climate change? What can we say about overdevelopment and land use in the watershed? These are not things that have easy answers. And so the very question of what is it that we know became very contentious. And so I think some of the lessons that come out of the story, and I develop this in more detail in the book, we have to hold those conflicts up to the light and take a look at them and find ways to work through them through dialogue, through more participatory approaches to modeling, through various processes of social learning, rather than try to diminish and minimize them by imposing at a very early stage an official story about what is the problem and therefore what is the limited range of solutions that we can entertain.
Yeah, Ken, I was just thinking about what you were saying about thinking of a place as a watershed, which is what we teach in our flood risk management work as well, constantly saying, think like a watershed. But as your other work also addresses that's not how we are organized politically and socially in most places. Based on your experience with Ellicott City, given the jurisdictional boundaries within a watershed, do you have suggestions about how that watershed approach could be taken if we're looking at Ellicott City in a different way for the future?
Yeah, there's no question that the borders of Howard County. So Ellicott City is actually not an incorporated town with its own city council and budget and police department and schools. It used to be, but it lost its charter of incorporation early in the 20th century. It's a very distinct place, but it's not a jurisdiction. And it's a small community that's embedded in a much larger county. And that county itself, the borders of that county consist almost entirely of rivers. And so the Patapsco River, which is where Ellicott City is situated, forms the northern and eastern border of much of the county. And the Patuxent River forms the southern and western. And so right off the bat, we've used these lifelines, these arteries that ought to flow through the center of our communities instead as borders to bound and to separate us. And that's the reality of the political world, of the legal world, of the administrative world. And we're always going to be battling that, and we're always going to be tilting against that. And while we might like the idea of taking a more biocentric approach to how we organize our communities, that's a fight for the long haul. And we've got to get through the short term. What's interesting, I did a lot of interviews with all sorts of people across the county, people in county government, activists, shopkeepers, residents of the watershed, just historic preservationists, a range of different people with many different points of view about what should be done. And the last question I would always ask in the interviews was, if you were writing the last chapter of this book, where I'm trying to convey some of the lessons from this drama, what would you want people to know? What would you want to say? And I got a lot of great ideas from that, and I relay them in the book. But the one thing that was most common, regardless of where somebody came down on these big controversies around tearing down historic buildings or digging a mega tunnel or whatever it may be, you've got to be an activist. And at the end of the day, one of the themes that I really try to stress in the book is that there are always bigger interests and outside forces, whether it is flood engineers or real estate markets or whatever it might be, that are going to see in your community's flood or wildfire or drought or whatever it may be, they're going to see an opportunity to be seized or a problem to be solved that's not going to recognize the uniqueness of your place, the specialness of your place, the way that people want to live in that place. And so I think the first step above all else is that people have to get organized. They have to learn their socio-ecological history. They have to build unusual coalitions that link environmentalists, historic preservationists, community activists of various forms, and make sure that when we're grappling with these tough questions, what do we know to be true about this place? What do we value most about this place? What are we not willing to change about this place? That local knowledge and those local values are really at the center of the story, because the larger jurisdictional and administrative categories and divisions and units are not going to be able to see that place as a place. They're going to see it as a problem. They're going to see it as an opportunity, and they're going to start pulling the levers on some of their standard solutions. And that's what people need to engage.
Ken, given that, what you just said, from your experience with those folks that you spoke to and what you saw, are people clinging to the past? Or are people recognizing that the future is going to be different and they have to adapt and their place has to adapt? Do you have a sense of that?
This was one of the most divisive issues, right? One of the popular solutions that was championed by one of the county executives was to tear down a large slice of the historic district and open up the floodplain, make room for the river, so to speak, make room for actually a stream channel that passes through town. And you can understand that argument because the stream channel passes right under the last stretch of a dozen or so buildings on its way to the river. And so it's a really problematic situation from a stormwater management point of view. And initially, the dialogue really polarized. Tear the buildings down. don't tear the buildings down. And some people were arguing, well, we've been here 250 years and we've always had to adapt. It's not about the buildings. What's historic about Ellicott City is that there's been this living, breathing community here for 250 years that has adapted and faced these sorts of challenges and will do so again. And there's other people that felt that those buildings had only survived for 250 years or however long they had survived because they had these ardent defenders who were willing to defend them. And so it became really polarized around the question of what was special, what was historic here, what was it that had to be preserved. In this case, I think the county actually found its way to a reasonably sensible decision on this. Rather than tear down the 10 buildings, because of that controversy, they stepped back, revisited it. There was an election that shuffled the deck a little bit, and they made a decision to take out 4 of the buildings, preserve the front facade of 6 of the 10 buildings, daylight the stream to a substantial extent, and re-engineer the way the stream goes to the river. It's difficult to know whether that's going to be an effective and functional solution in the long run, but it struck me as an example of getting to closer to a compromise solution. It wasn't easy to get there. And I think thinking about how do we navigate a conflict like this? How do we generate the knowledge we need? Things like that really are much of the message I'm trying to convey with my work and with my book.
Ken, thanks for coming on. Thanks for sharing your message.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ken. It's always fabulous to talk with you. I can't wait to read the rest of the book. I read 1 chapter and I am really looking forward to sharing it with others.
Thanks. Great to be here. I'm a big fan of the podcast and the work that you're both doing.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Irantzu Serra Lasa. Irantzu is the founder of her own company. Hi, Irantzu. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Doc. How are you doing? Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on, and I was really quick with that introduction, but I just want, can you tell us the name of the company?
My company is called Resilure, and it's focused on disaster resilience on the built environment.
Fantastic. We're going to just dive into some of these questions. And so you have background in architecture and construction. Can you tell us a bit about your background? How'd you get into that space, and how did you get into what you're doing now?
Yes, I am an architect and urban planner by training. And while I started on the private sector, worked in both architecture office and construction companies back in Spain, at some point in my career, I transitioned into humanitarian work, since this was around 2010 when the Haiti earthquake happened. And since that moment, I've been working with different organizations from the Red Cross, both internationally and here with the American Red Cross, and then transition to Habitat for Humanity International. And all of my focus has been on both disaster resilience and reconstruction post-disasters.
Can you explain, this is as part of your signature of what you do, but what is HLP? And then you have Shelter and Settlements Disaster Resilience. And I think it's pretty obvious what that is, but just more broadly, can you just explain, because that's part of your position description?
Correct. So HLP stands as housing, land, and property rights, and it's anything that has to do with the right that people have to the land they occupy. It is something that we tend not to see and goes hidden, especially in disaster recovery, but is one of the biggest hurdles that actually does not allow for reconstruction to happen. Think about people not having, for example, clear land title. And then when reconstruction is to happen, funding cannot get to families because they cannot prove ownership of the land. So it would be that area. And then disaster resilience, as I think it is easier to understand, but it goes into what does it take for the built environment to actually be able to withstand a disaster, or for societies to recover from a disaster in a way that does not compromise their future assets, and making sure that it happens in a way that actually connects with Build Back Better, or trying to do things in a different way so that the next disaster does not impact the same way.
Irantzu, I know we met a long time ago in Haiti and faced a lot of challenging situations there, and you've worked in so many different places on different issues. I'm wondering, in the world of shelter reconstruction, post-disaster, broadly speaking, how have you seen things change over the years? And in particular, what are your thoughts about how the environment and now how climate and climate change is being addressed in shelter reconstruction?
I think since I started, something that is become quite evident to me is that the professionals that work in this type of work, most of us tended to jump into one of these big operations because there was a massive disaster and there was a big need for architects or engineers. And it happened in a very organic way. Like my own transition to it was not a second thought, but not necessarily what I had planned initially. It feels that now there is much more like professionalization of the sector and career paths that need to be much more tight and prepared. Lots of people start with internships, and it's harder to actually get on the sector than I feel it was probably when I started. On the other hand, there is way more disasters than when I started. Climate change is definitely exacerbating the amount of disasters and how intense they are. And that means that there's definitely a demand for this type of professionals and a demand for people who know how to address recovery issues and realizing that they are much more complex than just building something.
So from a policy standpoint and just practically speaking, what do you think would be beneficial when you're thinking about doing climate? We're talking about how climate change is really supercharging this. How, from a policy standpoint, what could help?
I think at the policy level, and it depends if you're looking at the US or international, right? In the US, I feel part of the work that needs to be done at the policy level is really mapping what tend to be the hurdles for people to be able to recover and see if there is work that can be done before a disaster happens, because most of the vulnerable communities may actually find it much harder to recover if those things are not worked through in what we call blue skies. An example, and very clear example from the US, is Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. If you think about Puerto Rico, most of the people who live there do not actually have clear title to the land. And when the disaster happened, FEMA came in to provide support. And guess what? Their guidelines actually did not allow for people to justify their ownership of the land unless it was with clear title. And they had to reject over 70% of the requests for support from people in the island. So doing all of that work before a disaster hits and understanding how support is being provided and what are the constraints that people may actually face could be a very simple way for policy to address the reality on the ground instead of assuming that the reality is a much more standardized situation across all of the territory.
A lot of these disasters, it's not necessarily even the first time it's hit certain areas, and especially in the United States when it comes to flooding, you might have the same spot flooding over and over. How do we break this cycle of disaster and rebuilding? You must have a lot of thoughts on that.
Oh, absolutely. And a lot of it, there is different components that are more systemic and not just one single piece. On the one hand, we have areas that are prone to flooding, and can they be mitigated so that they don't get flooded? And if they cannot, is actually that space the right space for people to live in? If people are living there, are there ways that their houses could be retrofitted or reinforced? Can they be elevated, for example, so that if a flooding comes in, the damage is less and their vulnerability has been reduced?
Ira, I want to go back to what you said earlier about the change in the approach to shelter reconstruction and your own experience as an architect and a construction expert. It's shifting into humanitarian work, and now there are more professionals in the sector who are working in the architect or construction or engineering space. So I'm wondering, if you were hiring a team now to work with you on a shelter reconstruction project, what kind of skill sets would you look for? And would you expect the academic institutions, the vocational institutions that are training people to be preparing the skill sets that you would look for in a team? And if not, how would you provide that experience for a team working with you?
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, when I was saying that the sector has professionalized, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is more professionals. It actually means that the way to get in seems to be less organic and more constrained. Mm-hmm. I think we are definitely in need of people who understand construction, and most of the cases, architects or engineers are at the core of that, but not necessarily from only a design perspective, but also from a process perspective. We need people with the skill sets in project management. We need people with skill sets on understanding the social vulnerabilities of the communities that are being served. Something that I don't think that neither architecture schools or engineering schools provide is what we call more of a social technical career, like a social architect or a social engineer, because when reconstruction happens, it's not just about building or rebuilding the object or the house. A lot of times funding might be more about a process and for people to self-recover. And what you do as a professional is basically walking along communities so that they can recover themselves and providing technical support. Having people that may have those social skills combined with the technical skills in construction is super important and not necessarily something that you find by default in new graduates. Is something that you turn to either learn through the process or partner with other type of professionals who can actually bring that piece. But it's not just about the product that you're rebuilding. It's not about how fast you can do a prefab construction so that it can shelter people. It's more about what can you provide as a core, what can you provide as an enabling mechanism so that more people get supported and they can actually improve it as they move on so that they have the ability to maintain it and to expand it if needed.
Just a follow-up to that then, do you see or would you expect those people on those teams to have a basic understanding or appreciation for the role of a healthy environment in the reconstruction process? Would they have experience in understanding how a changing climate impacts their work and the communities that they're working with? Is that a given, or is there still more work to be done in that space?
I think those who have been long enough in the sector may actually understand that's the case, and there's a lot of work to try to recover in a way that is, as I said, is resilient and is not jeopardizing the future. It might be something that needs to be included in curriculum in a more intentional way, because there is, as I said, a lot of pressure, if you will, to try to have a product-based approach versus actually understanding that if you have the right process, things are going to be way more sustainable and are going to help that reconstruction process to happen for more people and to happen in a more cohesive and coherent way.
Can you tell us more about what you're doing with Howard University here in DC?
As part of a larger coalition of organizations, we're trying to see how we can support a career path for engineers and architects to be able to become humanitarian shelter and settlements practitioners. Right now, there is a big gap in the US of that type of profile. There's more on the international arena. Europe or Australia do have master's degrees on that, but there is none that exist in the US. So we're Howard University, who's very grounded on equity and social justice, express interest in really seeing how their architecture students could explore this type of work. So we are supporting them in 3 fronts. The first one, they already have one of the subjects that they do normally in architecture, which is a studio, which every architect student goes through that. They chose to actually have a studio semester based on post-disaster reconstruction in Puerto Rico. So we have been having different practitioners supporting that class and trying to explain them what are the things that they will find in a recovery operation post-hurricane in that case. We are also working with them in making them part of a series of conference on housing, land, and property rights, jointly with the University of Puerto Rico School of Law. So there is this collaboration between both the schools to try to map what are these hurdles connected to housing, land, and property rights. And then the last piece, we're working on supporting the creation of the first humanitarian shelter and settlements course, which will hopefully happen next spring in 2025, so that there's a start of a course with having like different practitioners coming to give talks to the students and having a much more structured way to learn about this, with the objective that maybe if the students actually want to follow this path in 3 to 5 years, there might be the possibility to create a master's degree on it. It's the first step, and definitely we're seeing a lot of excitement from the students, and they are attuned to what the realities on the ground are. And I think it's a great match also because that's the perspective that we have as professionals.
If my adaptation student listeners, and I have quite a few, want to go into disaster reconstruction as a profession, what sort of advice would you give them? And it's my understanding too that there's a real shortage of architects out there too. So I don't know if that would play into your answer.
Yeah, you're totally right. There is, for some reason, less and less architecture students that start architecture every year. And that also creates a hurdle because that's for private sector, but also for this type of work. But for those who are interested on being part of the solution, or actually not only working towards, I would say right now, there are not necessarily that many courses in the US that are focused on that, but there are resources that they can check online. And especially if they were to go to a website that is called Shelter Projects, that actually has a lot of learnings on how we approach shelter and settlements in the humanitarian environment. There's opportunities, as I said, for master's degree right now only in Europe, but definitely the cost is way less than what it would cost to have a master's here in the US. And I would say try to volunteer or work with different organizations that are involved in this type of work, from Habitat for Humanity to there is Un Techo para Mi País, which are a bit on the international side. There is Care International also does shelter and settlements, and the International Federation of the Red Cross too, and try to get themselves connected with professionals in the sector and try to see if, obviously, when there is a big disaster, the opportunity window to get involved is much higher. And because right now there tends to be more and more disasters happening, and not only on the climate related ones, but also conflict and displacement, which is a total different story, but with very similar skill sets needed to really try to see if they can get connected and enter the sector.
Well, I get this question a lot, and I imagine you do as well. If you work in the disaster space, people not in that profession think, not surprisingly, that it could be fairly depressing work. I'm just wondering, what do you look forward to in the future? What kinds of change do you see on the horizon that inspire you to do the work that you do?
You can take everything as being depressing or not. I see myself as part of the solution, not necessarily what depresses me is probably the impacts of all of those disasters and how people are going and suffering through them. But for me, it's both working on anything connected with disaster preparedness, or which would be connected with climate change adaptation, and how do we build in a different way so that houses are more resilient and communities therefore are more resilient. And when a disaster happens, what really keeps me grounded is working alongside the communities and making everything about the communities that we are serving, and less about, as I said, the product or the housing or the design, and is more about how can we help people recover and what would be the best solution for them to be able to move forward in a pathway to get their permanent home or their reconstructed home, and what would it take for that.
Thank you so much. This was fantastic. I learned a bunch.
Thank you, Ira. This is great. I really appreciate making the time. It's always fun to talk with you, and I always learn a lot.
Thank you, Doc and Anita, for having me here. It's really exciting to be part of this podcast. And if anyone might be interested in learning more, feel free to check my LinkedIn account and all of the updates that I tend to put there all the time.
Hey, Adapters. Joining us is Achala Navaratni. Achala is the Regional Director of the Asia Pacific Office for American Red Cross. Hey, Achala. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Anita. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Hi, Achala. This is Doug, and I'm going to be co-hosting this with Anita. And we're going to just start things off with, what do you do there as the Regional Director? Just give us some background on your position and roles and responsibilities.
Thanks, Doug. As the Regional Director for American Red Cross, my job is to support other Red Cross, Red Crescent national societies in Asia Pacific to implement disaster risk reduction and response and climate programs in partnership with the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent, IFRC. And my role is to, as American Red Cross, represent American Red Cross and also ensure funding support and partnership building and connecting those Red Cross, Red Crescent network into American organizations and American institutions. We work with 6 what we call priority countries where we really focus on, and I support the country teams led by a country representative in Nepal, Bangladesh, Philippines, Indonesia, Timor-Leste, and I also support program implementation team that is based in Pacific to implement climate program. I also help the team that is managing the climate programming in the Pacific to manage those programs and develop those relationships. So overall, it's a role that works with country Red Cross Red Crescents, its partners, our team members, as well as the IFRC, and then other agencies like the UN, WWF, IUCNs, and others.
That is this amazing, diverse set of stakeholders that you're working with. I want to get into this here, that you have this fascinating background in engineering, environmental management, and leading a humanitarian agency there. And so how have you been able to integrate these different disciplines into your humanitarian work? And why is that so important?
That's a good question, Doug. So I think having background in multiple sectors is helpful because the world's problems are not singular sector. We always have to work with multi-sector teams and different partners and agencies. And a lot of the time, though we work in the same area, sometimes we don't speak the same language. Having a multi-sector background, now in my case, having an engineering background from a civil structural perspective and an environmental management background. And then on top of that, now humanitarian background helps me to speak between those different teams or sectors. And that helps me to then address broader issues and bring the necessary people on board when it is needed. When we are so focused on one area, a lot of the time, we don't see who else could be at the table, who else could be contributing. Having that multi-sector background has definitely helped me to bring that approach of working together, seeking additional help and assistance where it is necessary, and not to do things alone. Because the issues that we are dealing with, like the climate crisis or a lot of the humanitarian crisis, requires multitude of partners, multitude of skill sets and competencies. That's how I think my background has been very helpful in the current work that I'm doing to connect the dots.
Achala, you and I started working together way back in 2006 when I met you in Sri Lanka after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. And back in those days, including the environment and disaster-related work wasn't common, and quite frankly, it wasn't that popular. And things have changed over the years, thankfully. But I'm wondering, do you feel that environmental or nature-based solutions are skill sets that you can easily recruit for your staff and your teams? And if not, like, how are you finding the talent of the future? And what do you think the talent of the future in the humanitarian space will need to have when it comes to issues dealing with the environment and nature-based solutions?
Thanks, Anita. Yeah, it's an interesting question. It takes me back to my first days working for WWF and going to the American Red Cross office to sit there and try to understand how can I help them to see things from an environmental lens, how to see the environmental sustainability aspects in the work they were doing. It's, I think, the skill set to come to that. In my case, I was fortunate, as I mentioned, to have the background of multiple sectors. And then in this unique case, when I was in Sri Lanka with these two organizations that were trying to work together for the common cause of making sure whatever the disaster recovery efforts that were happening were done in an environmentally sustainable manner. And not only in an environmentally sustainable manner, but also to institutionally look at it from that perspective. I think the challenge was the intention and the interest was there as institutions, but maybe again, there was as I would say, a lost in translation that was happening. And I felt I was in a very unique position to connect the dots and understand what the humanitarians wanted, because it's also not only about a sectoral aspect, it's also a time scale aspect. A lot of the time, the humanitarian partners want to get things done fast. They have to do that because many people are affected by humanitarian issues. And a lot of the time they're responding for an event and action needs to happen not tomorrow. It needed to happen yesterday. In that type of an environment, how do you get people to start seeing 1 month ahead, 1 year ahead, or 5 years ahead is always something challenging. And the trick to that process was to, at the beginning, being an environmental focal point or environmental advisor to the Red Cross at that point, my approach was not to go and preach my environmental work to the humanitarians, but my job was to just listen what they wanted, go with them to the field to see what were their problems, and then figure out where there were opportunities for me to intervene. And that allowed then to bring in that ownership where and solving problems for them, because always there are environment, the issues are there which you need to support and help. So not to push things, but to go there and find those solutions. Again, when it comes to this, what I'm trying to highlight is you can have all the technical skill sets you want, but you also need to build your soft skill sets, which is the competencies on emotional intelligence to understand and empathize with who you're working with and why we are working with them, and try to do that. But yes, the technical skills are important. But what I saw sometimes was the technical people from the environmental sector would talk to the technical people from the humanitarian sector, and they didn't see eye to eye, or they didn't hear what each other was saying. The world obviously has changed over the last years, in the last decades, because the climate crisis has clearly opened the eyes of the humanitarian community that environment is not an option. It is what we do. Climate-induced disasters are happening every day. And if we do not address the climate aspects in our own programming and in our own institutions, we're just become a part of the problem and not part of the solution. I think the skill sets that we need to develop in the humanitarian sector are now very much in line with what the environmental sector used to do. Because what we are responding to previously, can just go and be a humanitarian cowboy or cowgirl, just running and getting things done, moving things, and let's say cash grants or distributing things. Unfortunately, these disasters, those parts are necessary, but that's not enough anymore. Our disasters have become complex. We need to start looking, we need to start thinking of mitigation, adaptation, all of that. And the humanitarian organizations have to do that. So the skill sets we need now require people with environmental background. I'm lucky to have that, but we need more of them. We need people who bridge multi-sectors with backgrounds in multiple sectors. And we need to encourage people to take multi-sector learning and opportunities, because a lot of the time the engineers tend to go and study engineering, and they continue to study engineering and continue to study engineering. The environmental people start continuing to study only the environmental ones, but not these multi-sector ones. So this is where I see the opportunities to look at things in a different way. I landed in the Red Cross because I was seeing that before, that multi-sector approach, and being able to do that. So skill sets wise, training wise, what do we need to do? We need to see, even in the universities, can we create this cross learning, give those opportunities? I remember I went to a course at University of California, Berkeley, to do engineering. But because I had classes in environmental management in areas that were not just related to engineering, it opened my eyes to ultimately work with WWF, and then ultimately now ended up in the Red Cross. So to people who are studying, what I would say is, when you have the opportunity, when you are in the university, take that extra class that you think is not related to you, but ultimately in life, it becomes so much more important. I took a class on communications. My God, that has been so important, because this podcast, if we don't communicate, how can we get our message across? So lots of things that are related to your job 10 years or 20 years down the line, you have an opportunity to do that in university or in the courses that we take. But a lot of the time we don't do that because we tend to stick to our comfortable areas of our sector, our area, our work, comfortable area of focus.
You talked about a lot of these things that people are going to need, these skill sets, but you specifically, do you recruit staff in environmental or NBS experience, and why or why not? Do they have to have that before you hire them?
Yeah, so we do. The short answer is we do, because now as the American Red Cross, we have domestically in the US, we realize that most of the disasters are driven by climate, and we need to address this issue. Internationally, we have seen this with our partner national societies seeing this. So we are often forced to look at these things without having the necessary expertise. And that's why now we've launched this large climate program to look at opportunities for adaptation, both in the US as well as working globally. And to do that, we needed to hire people who understood what was going on and can explain to us in a short version, I would say, explain to the cowboys how the farmers work and creating that joint effort of understanding the long-term impacts, how to engage in adaptation. So we have hired professionals in the environmental sector, people who have that environmental background. We also not only hire, but the other piece we do is we partner with agencies that have that skill set to bring that skill set together. So we partner with environmental partners. We partner with partners like Climate Center, who are able to articulate to us, okay, these are the areas that we need to work on. If you want to create change, you need to have people who are able to see beyond project periods, the longer term vision, and then those different projects and programs lead to that longer term vision. Yes, we are hiring people in the environmental sector, but we are also looking for people with that multi-sector experience, as I explained previously.
For my adaptation listeners who are interested in working in the humanitarian sector, what advice do you have for them to be equipped for the challenges presented by a changing climate and extreme weather events? What would you say to them?
I would say to them that the humanitarian sector is looking for people like you and to take the opportunity to find those organizations and engage them. Now, how can you do that? It's always daunting. Like when you're in the organization, it's always easy to say, hey, we want to hire people. But a lot of the time, people don't know how to get there. So the best way is look for internship opportunities because that's the easiest way to get in. Very often, there may be not specifically environmental positions that are advertised. There may be positions that are closer to that, but engaging in climate programming or nature-based solutions, and then take those opportunities to apply and come in. Because when we advertised also, one of the things as humanitarian organizations that we see is not many people from the environmental sector apply for those jobs because they feel, oh, I'm switching a sector or I won't fit in. So that's another piece where I think it's good to, if you don't want to apply for the job or if you're scared to apply for a job, you can always test it out, take an internship, take a stretch assignment from a current job, or find a partnership opportunity that your organization is already having and work with us because we need help. We need the environmental partners to work with us. We need the expertise from the environmental people with environmental competencies to work with us because we are trying to deal with a large problem. And that only way we can do it is together.
If my listeners want to learn just more about what you do there and what the American Red Cross International is doing, what would you recommend they do?
I would recommend them to go to our website and check the international services, as well as I would recommend them to go to the International Federation's website and understand how we are working on the climate front, especially with the climate charter, the broader climate strategies, and how they are helping all national societies of the Red Cross Red Crescent spread around the whole world in all the countries to adapt to the changing climate.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. You're doing fantastic work out there, and we appreciate you coming on and sharing your advice about the future workforce.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks for having me here.
All right, adapters, I am back with Anita. She's coming back on. We just had these 3 fantastic conversations. Those were fun conversations, and they were very enlightening. Initial thoughts, Anita, what did you think?
I thought they were all very interesting and very different and really reinforced for me some thoughts that I've been wrestling with as we've developed the program that I lead now and the things that we've learned over the years. So, for example, there's a concept that I just learned about not that long ago through some reading called the T-shaped person. And I think that's just so interesting and really lends itself to some of the issues that Ken Conca was talking about. And as I understand it, T-shaped person has a depth of knowledge in a particular area, and that's the T part of the T. And then across the top, there is breadth that touches on different sectors. And that is exactly what I need in the workforce that works with me on my team. And that's what I see going forward in other sectors would be useful to focus on what my program is all about. And that's reducing risk and vulnerability going forward. So I thought that Ken's discussion was really interesting and also touched on the non-technical skills that we all need in terms of communicating, something you're expert in, Doug, but also just understanding different social and economic issues that touch on the work that we do. I thought his experience with that flood and his observations of the complexity and his recommendations for people going forward, I thought were really interesting.
Any more challenges or opportunities you think in this kind of workforce recruitment?
Again, I think how we learn and his commentary about education by the slice, thinking creatively of how we can marry academic training and careers with practice on the ground, technical vocational skills on the ground, helping people to be lifelong learners. I think that's going to be crucial for all of us in terms of adapting to a changing climate and adapting to multiple and compound factors that increase risk for all of us.
I've been doing this podcast for a while now, and I have young people reach out, not even young people, even mid-career people who are interested in getting to the adaptation space, and just hearing the diversity of skills that you might need, or just the diversity of sectors that you could work in. It's just the sky's the limit if you're getting to the adaptation space. These are going to be good jobs. There's going to be interesting jobs, and they're going to be impacting a lot more sectors than people realize. I think that's a really huge opportunity and something very exciting because, it's not great why it's a growth industry, but it's for professionals coming in, there's going to be a lot of opportunities.
There are. And I think even comments that Achala Navaratni made about developing the skills to listen before speaking, to listen before sharing your own knowledge, and how he was able to use that to really advance some of the work in the early days around integrating the environment into disaster management. That's one of those soft skills that it's difficult to teach, but it's so important in practice. And so I think you're right. It's an exciting time to be on the front end of your career. There's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of need, and there's places to go to get experience and to learn both technically and academically, as well as practically in different workforce opportunities. So I look forward to helping to shape that, to working with people like you and the folks that we talked to today to really address that, because the need is going to be there. The demand is going to be there no matter how successful we are with our different policies to reduce risk. And so it's in my view, our advantage, both as individuals, as members of our local communities, as members of our professional sectors, to really be creative, reach out to those who you don't normally engage with or learn from, and try to bring that back to your workplace and to the people that you surround yourself with on a daily basis.
Anita, we're going to wrap this up, but what can listeners do to support or engage with efforts to build this future workforce? So what would you recommend they do? What would be some next steps for them, even in challenging times?
I think what I often recommend to people is we have to start locally. So wherever we're living or working at the moment, I think it's beneficial to get to know your own local government officials, get to know your own local civic society organizations that work with or are responsible for disaster risk management, and learn their processes and procedures and ask them questions about how they're addressing some of the risks that we're facing from compounding issues, be it a changing climate or different land use patterns that are exacerbating risk, and prompt them to address some of the challenges and discuss how they are being creative, how they're looking at different disciplines, how they're looking at risk from a systemic perspective. We can practice that where we live in our own neighborhoods and in our own communities. And then in the workplace, we can do the same thing and find out how risk is being addressed. Are there different skill sets that are being brought to bear to addressing that, and get involved from whatever perspective or framework you're involved in, be it in sciences or technology or communication or the creative fields of art, can all be applied to addressing risk.
Yep. And I encourage my listeners, this problem of climate change is not going to go away. And so there's going to be a need for adaptation work, and you're going to have to be creative. You're going to have to be innovative. And even when things get challenging in our ability to respond to it, there's going to be a demand for you to do adaptation. So find your niche and figure things out and bring that creativity to these programs. So Anita, I'm going to let you go. I want to thank you again. It's always great collaborating with you and World Wildlife Fund. And thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Doug, for tackling this subject and for supporting the folks out there who are really trying to work on the front lines of reducing risk. We really appreciate it. And thank you to your listeners as well.
Okay, adapters, that is a wrap. Thanks to Anita, Ken, Hiru, and Achala for joining this episode. A huge thank you to my guests for sharing their expertise and experiences in disaster resilience and climate adaptation. Their insights highlight not just the challenges, whether it's balancing infrastructure and community needs, professionalizing disaster recovery, or integrating nature into resilience planning, but also the incredible opportunities in this evolving field. The adaptation workforce is growing, and the need for interdisciplinary, innovative thinkers has never been greater. Whether you're a student, a policymaker, or someone looking to make an impact, there's a place for you in this space. And thanks to Anita for joining me in this episode. Okay, adapters, keep up the great work. I'll see you next time.